Today's guest, one of its kind executives in the people field, Stefan Ries.
But the best learning for me was always reverse mentoring. So I have, for example, asked people who just started at SAP to join me for a week or for a day and just come along with me in all of those meetings or decisions I have to make, sitting in my office, hearing me talking to people. And then at the end of the day, we spoke about it. And I specifically asked them and said, what would you have done differently? Now, obviously, when you ask as a board member and a new startup at SAP, that person is usually a little bit hesitant, but I provoked them and I said, no, we're not going to leave the office unless you tell me what you found good or bad, or what would you have done differently.
Stefan is a HR punk, business angel, brand ambassador, supervisory board member, and senior advisor to startups and corporates. His career started in the early days of Microsoft in the 90s in Europe, where he started as an HR consultant and later on did an HR lead role at HP, also in Germany, and ultimately moved to SAP and became Chief Human Resource Officer. And in between, spent some time as an executive search consultant at Egon Zehnder. Stefan and I met 2 years ago when we did some projects together at TIER, where he was a senior business advisor and I did some executive searches for them. In this episode, we talk about SAP, analogies from sports and how high-performing teams can look like, the importance of diversity, the importance of mentoring, and just how to be a good leader. So let's dive directly into it.
Then you can build trust, and then you can spend less time communicating and more time just getting shit done.
Then I went home and thought about this sentence.
We basically put it on the table.
Hiring takes time. People are trained.
How to objectively judge certain situations.
It's very, 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 very hard to change things.
That was the learning.
Entrepreneurs with
To
empathy.
the people side.
Hi Stefan, can you tell us more about the start of your career?
Hey Thomas, pleasure to meet you. Of course I can. Well, I've started after my university degree in economics in the early 90s. At that point in time, I had always the big desire or wish to continue what I had in mind while I was at the university, which basically gave me the direction of trying to continue to work with people, but at the same time, early 90s, also to stay curious about the tech business. And as such, I had this great opportunity to join, I think it was 91, yeah, if my memory is correct. I joined Microsoft. At that point in time, the company was small, little, tiny, headquartered here for Europe, Middle East, and Africa in Munich. And there, I've started my career as a human resources specialist at that point in time called, mainly driving recruitment activities, but also being responsible for obviously not only attracting talents, but also to make sure what are the best measures to keep them on board, motivate the workforce, and retain the talents and develop them as much as possible. So that was my fast start in the early 90s.
Very exciting. So could you tell us more about the environment back then at Microsoft in Munich? Because I think it was pre-tech bubble and Microsoft was maybe not a big name there yet, or yes.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. I remember my first day when I entered the office building and saw the warehouse, and the warehouse was completely empty. Because we didn't have any products. And I remember those were the times where the products were shipped on floppy disks, not even on CDs or CD-ROMs. It was floppy disks. And so you needed a warehouse.
What is a floppy disk?
Yeah, a floppy disk. You probably don't know it, right? This is 5 1/4 inch wobbling disks which you had to plug in your computer in order to educate the computer what kind of programs you need. Hard disks were almost unknown at that point in time. So when you restarted the computer, you had to educate this tech tool right from the beginning, operating system, and then later on also when Microsoft started the whole Windows game, for example, that was even before that. So the environment was really crazy. It felt like a startup, and in fact, it was a startup. Microsoft around the world was pretty small and tiny at that point in time. And they made that big deal with IBM in order to make sure that they deliver the software. Because I think, remembering those days back, probably IBM underestimated the strengths of the software. They relied very much on the hardware side of the house and thought, well, maybe we can outsource the software business. Well, these days, you know that this game has completely changed, and software, artificial intelligence, and everything else. This is basically the key driver of the tech business, and not so much the hardware anymore, because there you have seen the continuous involvement of the capabilities. And back in my days, I remember exactly the day I've got my first hard disk, which was pretty small, and it cost a fortune. But this is when you started to change a little bit the game, because you didn't have to re-educate the hardware all the time.
Interesting. And do you remember back then what the business strategy was of Microsoft and why they had a site in Munich? And what was your purpose of your role back then?
Yeah. I mean, the purpose of Bill Gates and the team was always to conquer the world. And at that point in time, I met him when I joined in 91 pretty fast, because he came to Munich and ran, as we would call it these days, an all-hands meeting. And I was very much impressed. I mean, he's a nerd, right? He comes completely from the tech side of the house, but he had a very clear vision. And his vision in 1991 was information at your fingertips. And I thought, what the hell is he talking about? Information at your fingertips, right? When you translate, or when you do now the fast forward to these days, you know what it is. We have all the information available we need on our fingertips. And that was his vision. That was his goal. And why did he open an office in Munich? Simple rule. Whenever Microsoft, through their software business, was able to reach the $1 million revenue stream per country, they decided that they need a hub there in order to make sure that they have a close proxy to the customers, understand the local market, and also operate from there. So my goal is, when I joined Microsoft there, the branch in Munich was already established, but it was pretty much clear that soon after Austria, Switzerland, and all the East European countries at that point in time followed pretty fast. And my role was very close with the business to find the right best candidates whenever we opened an office. So, for example, we went pretty fast to your home country in Austria. We had to find a general manager. We had to find a pre-sales person, a salesperson, and an assistant. Those four were always the base layer of the organization. And remember, I mean, at that point in time, no smartphone, no smart applications, even Excel and PowerPoint didn't exist. The pre-product of Excel was called Microsoft Multiplan. Hardly anybody remembers. And when I remember my times at the university, you saw these big mainframe machines, which you had to feed with all the information. And obviously his vision of information at your fingertips forced also the hardware manufacturer to make the units smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is when you saw the first Commodore or IBM clones entering the market, even for people like us at home, using hardware technology for writing text, playing games, but also at the same time starting more and more professional applications. Internet didn't exist. It just
How did you
became a
hack
few
Hunt
years
back
later.
then?
That was a fascinating period of time, Thomas, because you had to find out what are the local newspapers. So you had to advertise the jobs basically in local newspapers or in tech papers, which didn't exist a lot at that point in time either, and ask for application on paper, which those applicants sent to you. So the screening process and also to start the interview process before you had the first interview, it just took weeks. Yeah, and think about when you enter a country, like in my case, I was then at the first time in Poland, in Czech Republic, in also in Kazakhstan. You didn't know anything about it, and the capabilities for talents on the market to speak English was not such a broad knowledge either. So it was really interesting times at that point in time.
So tech in the 90s was non-tech.
Yeah, but when you are born and raised later, you probably say this is dinosaur age. I cannot even imagine how those people communicated. But think about when Germany hosted the World Cup in 2006, the smartphone didn't even exist. So I had no idea when you now look into our electronic gadgets, how you connect, how you communicate, how you even make appointments. Different world.
And then you moved to HP, but it was a different company and then acquired by HP, I guess, right?
Yes, correct. Then I moved because I had an opportunity to join Compaq Computers, which was headquartered also in the US, but in Houston, Texas. And they were a close partner to Microsoft, and they offered me an HR manager role, which was very, very early in my careers, a little bit after 4 years of experience. And that was the first time I had also the chance and the opportunity to lead a team. They also had an office in Munich, so I didn't have to change the city. And I joined them as the HR director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Basically, same story. Also making sure that Compaq was a well-established brand at that point in time on the B2B side, but also on the B2C side. That was the first time when you saw hardware machines at MediaMarkt, for example, for less than 5,000 Deutschmarks at that point in time. And they also conquered the different markets because it was like these days when you think about fast-moving unicorns, when they are trying to enter markets and to occupy the space so that the competition does not have such an opportunity to gain a lot of market share. Basically, same story there. But that was my first time when I had the chance to prove my leadership skills, or better, I would argue, to learn my leadership skills, because there was not a lot existing at that point in time.
And what did you learn out of this experience?
Yeah. First of all, I think looking now backwards, I really had the privilege always to learn a lot from my leaders and managers, and that was maybe luck, but at the same time also when I spoke to them, it was Uli at Microsoft, and it was Ronnie from Scotland and at Compaq Computers, and then later HP. They really acted like a role model. So how do you lead a team? How do you communicate? Well, first of all, how do you recruit the best people? How do you gonna recruit the best talents, right? Then how do you gonna keep them motivated day by day? How do you give them stretch goals so that they are able to grow their capabilities, but also at the same time give them enough space to grow and not micromanage them? And that was a very, very, very deep learning curve for myself. Now I come Likewise, you also from my background, I was when my parents gave me the chance to go to the university in parallel, I spent a lot of time also in sports. And in sports, it has a lot to do with team, right? So I played handball, but I also played tennis. So I had
Oh,
the
nice.
individual focus on performance, and on the same time also within handball as a team, you're just as good as strong as the team is. You can be an excellent individual player, you can be an excellent leader, but if the team is not following you, if you cannot share the passion or the power of individuals with a diverse background coming together and perform a match together, you're not going to win. And that came up very, very early in my career, and it was a really good learning curve. And I would, looking now backwards, would argue that was an excellent foundation for me before then later on I moved to SAP and had the chance there up to executive board member and be the chief people officer of SAP globally and worldwide. But the foundation were laid really in my early career days. And I would argue if I would have missed the first 4, 5, 6 years with those fantastic leaders who really role modeled what I had in my mind when I would grow up and gain more experience, I would have never had the chance to be also a passionate, powerful chief people officer of an organization, likewise SAP with more than 110,000 people.
Yeah, and not just any people, it's really specialized people, right? So that's also
Correct.
very, very difficult to get these 100,000 people assembled together in an organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, as you grow with your experience, of course, you just heard me talking about teams and handball, small team, right? I mean, handball, 7 people. But then you grow and grow and grow. Then, of course, you need to think about, okay, how can I best motivate the organization? How can I best motivate the company? What's the role of an HR professional? What's the role like your company, for example? How can I leverage companies like yours at its best in order to not only identify the talents, but then later on, once they are on board, keep them motivated and retain them? And this is when you think about our profession. In my early days, I always had the image in my mind: how can I make our profession stronger? And not always talk about, oh well, do we have a seat at the table, and is HR recognized as an important organization? I was looking more to the contrary. What can I contribute to the business so that they see our organization, my contribution is so important that it's not a question at all if we are sitting at the table or stand at the table, because the topics are very important. And looking back now into my 30 years of career, you still hear and see some companies and arguments why HR is not sitting at the board. But I believe now, especially right after COVID, this is the place to be. I mean, if you want to move the needle forward, if you want to see a big contribution to a company, and you see a lot happening these days on social medias to talk about soft skills, but also things like empathy or how do you lead talented people, this is our role, right? So not only administrative tasks, which of course, like in figure skating, you have to prove that you can run a payroll or you can recruit. But on the other side, the real art of the business is how do you identify the best talents, and how do you retain them within the organization? Because it's a proof of fact. If you have the best team, yeah, you play Champions League. If you don't have the best team, you're not playing Champions League. And therefore, for me, and for our community, like called people's business or human resources, it is so essential that the people do understand that this is now the time to play big balls, right? And
Yes.
and to win the game.
Super. So there are now several things I would like to dive a bit deeper
Sure.
into. So first of all, again, the tennis analogy. I really liked it because I also remember back then once Bill Gates recommended a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. Do you know that book?
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
also read it, and I'm a passionate tennis player, and I think I also had a lot of learnings out of playing tennis with
Mhm.
combined with this book, and also what you said in terms of leading teams, especially
Yeah.
on how to objectively judge certain situations
Correct.
without any
Yeah.
emotion attached to it, right?
Right.
And and also regarding teams, you said handball has a smaller team, like 7 team members. With some organizations I supported, I saw that some managers said they don't want to have a bigger team than 7 ± 2. Do you have any opinion around that? How a effective team size should be? How big?
Yeah. Yeah. So let me tackle both. First of all, I'm likewise you. I'm a big believer that when you look into sports, a lot you can learn for leading teams or organizations. And likewise, when you look into the business, you can also use some transformational aspects and bring it back to the sports business. These days, for me, fascinating is when you look into analytics, what sports is doing. I mean, they analyze everything, right? Each and every game is analyzed almost like to the very last movement of each player. So they have all the stats in order to, after the game, to think about, okay, what went well and what went wrong in order to change the behavior and the habit and also how they act together as the team. Sometimes I feel, well, this kind of data is missing. Now, these days, we have the capabilities with software and hardware to analyze information, our team behavior. And I'm not talking about controlling or I'm not talking about things like performance management at the essence of just micromanagement the people. It's much more of, for example, when you look into handball, you know exactly what kind of setup helped them to overcome the defense line easier. And they repeat that and repeat that and repeat that once they are only successful. So why are you not doing that from the business side of the house? So I think we can learn a lot. Next to your book, I also read, and he was a famous player in the 80s. His name was Brad Gilbert, and his book was called Winning Ugly. And I looked at it and said, well, how can you win ugly? But in this book, likewise, the other one you have recommended, he described a lot, and he was not a very talented player, but he basically, and he was never number one in the world, but I think he was ranked number 4 or number 5, and he was beaten all of the top players because of the way he displayed and portrayed himself on the tennis ground. And even if he was miserably down and 2 sets behind, he showed his opponent that, well, the game is not over. I might come back. And gestures or the way how you behave and how you display yourself against somebody you're partnering with or playing against, this is very, very important. And therefore, I think those kind of aspects on what you can learn from sports business into the business world, especially where we now have the capability of facts, figures, and data, should be used more often. I've started a couple of years ago a huge initiative for HR professionals or people professionals to get more data savvy. By the way, this is one of the biggest gaps if I look into our education these days. We are not well educated if I compare ourselves to people, for example, in the finance business. They are much more educated on facts, figures, and data, and that's the business language. So I think HR professionals need to speed up there tremendously in order to learn a lot about it. And that will help us also to establish our profession on a much higher level.
Did your economics degree help you understand data more easily?
I would, yeah, I mean, in all fairness, I hated it while I was at the university, because it was so much theoretical background in micro and macroeconomics, and you had to do mathematical models. But it helped me to translate that into my business, right? And as you have heard me, my passion was people and tech. And I would have never probably encouraged myself to work in tech if I would not have the desire to work with machines and understand 0, 1, 0, 1, what does that mean? And yes, it was helpful. But in all fairness, not a lot of people I have had partners with at the university went to the people's business. Most of them went into the finance organization or to financial services business and stuff like that. So coming back to your second question, team size. Well, maybe there I'm also highly influenced what I have seen and learned over the probably the last decade of being in a corporate environment. So the last 10 years, especially in the software business, we changed completely the way how we designed or produced software or coded. Usually in the past, and I'm really exaggerating here, I'm doing black and white on the piano. So in the past, you basically develop prototypes. It was the so-called waterfall process. It took anything 3 to 6 months to design a new prototype. Very much likewise the automotive industry when you design a new car, for example. Then when you entered the business of the so-called software as a service business or SaaS business, and you focused much more on user interfaces, user design, user centricity, you saw the new design of developing code coming through so-called agile software development methodology. And that, by the way, is also very much used in the automotive industry, which I've mentioned before. What do they do? They sprint with small teams of maximum 10 people. They have an educated coach who help them to sprint in 1, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to develop new ideas, dismiss ideas, come up with new ones, and take it from there. Prototypes, new ideas are developed much faster. Most of the ideas are getting dismissed, but 2 or 3 ideas will make it to the next round. We also learned there that when teams of 10s are joining, and come together for 2 weeks, after 2 weeks, they're going to be dismissed and assembled in a different form again afterwards. So I relate a lot to, if I need to design teams, I would probably look at teams of 10. And then this is maybe what the whole Scrum process and Scrum Master education has educated me, that this was very, very helpful. Yes, you can also handle larger teams. It depends a little bit on what the duties are. But when I specifically look into R&D, engineering, developing new ideas, innovation management, I would probably stick to that maximum level of 10 people.
Interesting. And these 10 people, are they all in the same function, or are these cross-functional teams? No.
Yeah. In the early days, when Scrum started, it was very much in the R&D engineering environment exclusively. But then you find out that, oops, there's something missing. I mean, because when you develop a new code, what about the user interface? Or what are the market needs? So you also need different people to give you a customer insight, to develop a better customer experience. So over time, you saw that those teams were much more interdisciplinary organized. Very helpful. These days, when I look into projects, and not only within the IT business, as you know, I'm also working for a biscuit company. And there you see that the most successful teams, when they develop new ideas and sprinting, are completely cross-functional. They even have people from finance and HR sitting together because they need to translate the new ideas into, once the new baby is born, how are we going to develop that further? How are we going to go to market? What's the best marketing activity? How do we measure the success in finance? And by the way, what are the best people we can assign from the people side of the house?
Super interesting. What I just saw at a recent client of mine, that we structured the people organization in a way that, okay, you have some expertise functionally, but at the end, for the interface to the business, we have a so-called people product development stream where maybe business partners, but not just business partners, some kind of experts at a level of seniority who can really deal with the business from an understanding perspective, that they can really translate what outcomes do we need to deliver to have positive impact on the business goals, as you said, right? A real proactive attitude. And then assembling together teams behind the curtain that are developing certain products for organizations.
Correct. And I think this is the new art of our profession, whereas the last 20 years we were pretty much organized around the so-called Dave Ulrich model with the 3 pillars, right? You had the shared services functions, which fulfilled basically all the operational tasks. You had the centers of expertise, so experts in compensation and benefits, recruiting, talent development, and then you had the business partners. I think those days are over. That's a very static organization. Coming back again to handball, I mean, maybe you're going to survive the first 10 minutes with this static setup, but then the other team is realizing that's the way how you're going to play. You have to change it and you have to adapt. And I think the adaptation is exactly the process you have described. When the business environment is changing, you need the interface, business partner, or whoever you're going to call it. And that person assembles the team in the background to design a new service or different experience on how you recruit, how you develop the latest and the greatest comp or benefits tool for that certain population. And combined with the trend that anyhow, a lot of people want to see the services on the receiving side. So if the 2 of us would be employees, we would, of course, love to see that it's individualized.
Yes.
And it's not the same thing for everything. I want to be recruited as an individual. But I also want to be retained as an individual and not be seen as just number XYZ within the whole team. I really want to be seen that the company understands so much about me that they tailor specific retention measures, especially for my needs, and not just because of I'm part of finance or sales or marketing.
Like a product development organization is obsessed of its customers, right?
Correct. Now, obviously, the limitation is, I mean, just think about SAP of more than 100,000 people. You cannot administrate 120,000 bonus plans, right? Or you cannot administrate 120,000 individual development plans. But here, the 80-20 principle probably works. You look into, and I give you one specific example. When you think about learning, you develop for specific roles, specific learning journeys. And those are 80% fixed if the 2 of us would be, for example, people working in the sales organization. But the 20%, those are individualized because your strengths and your needs are different to mine. And that's also true when you are, when you are a coach of a handball club, right? 80%, they're doing the same thing. So they need the same level of fitness. They need to grab the ball. They need to throw goals. They need to communicate in the same language. But then you need to train the goalie, obviously differently than the forward left winger or the forward mid player who's orchestrating the game. Different skills, 20% different. And I think this is really the art of our people's business these days, because hopefully you and your organization, you attract the right talents with a very diverse background. Now, once you have them on board, obviously they have never played together. So the leader, he or she really needs to focus on the team goals, but at the same time also cannot rest on developing the individuals.
Totally, I love it. So maybe again a bit more into SAP, because I think it's really a tremendous experience and achievements what you accomplished there. So could you tell us a bit more about the environment when you started and then the environment when you left? Maybe also in a bit of revenue or organizational size numbers.
Yeah.
That would be super interesting.
Yeah. So so you've heard me talking about Microsoft, Compaq, and HP, and I joined SAP in 2001 and left them just now 3 years ago. And obviously, this organization was completely different when I joined them while I left. I joined them when the organization was less than 40,000 people. Now you've heard me talking about that this organization is close to 120,000 people. So much larger organization. Same thing was happening on the market capitalization or on the revenue side of the house. Almost similar to the growth when you look into the people's business. When I joined them, SAP developed code. We talked about prototyping in the way we have just discussed it. But at that point in time, the language they used was called ABAP, proprietary, a very specific programming language only used by SAP. It was a 100% on-premise environment. And I was always joking when I said, when a company made the decision to buy SAP software, you needed a bunch of good, well-educated engineers to get it started, almost like a Formula One car, right? Nobody can start a Formula One car without the pit lane and at least 4 or 5 engineers around it. So that was the old setup, very engineering focused, very German, European focused, although right after I've joined, they made significant steps to really develop their footprints of development centers all around the world pretty soon, which was the most important step in my mind, because there you had the chance to acquire talents from Japan to Brazil. And obviously they have completely different skills and backgrounds. And that helped us to migrate SAP to the tech giant you're seeing right now in the business. There was a huge crisis when we found out that the way how we develop code and software with our own proprietary software language called ABAP was something where the market says this is not the latest and the greatest technologies. So basically what we had to do is when we realized that the new software development methodology, but also the way how you code and the different languages used like Java and others, we had to reskill and retrain the whole organization. And that was not easy, Thomas, because we won as a team. Right, we had been seen as an organization which was really delivering a lot of value for the customers with the software solutions, and all of a sudden you saw that the market has turned into something different, and competition came up with faster, more agile, more ease of use software and technology, and that's why we had to retrain the organization and say goodbye to the babies which we had developed. And basically saw them as a baby, as a child, young adults. And then all of a sudden you had to say, we have to reset ourselves, our mindset, the way how we approach customers, the solutions we are designing and developing. But again, looking to the examples the two of us have used in sports, that's what you have to do there as well. You cannot rely on the success of the past. And I think this is a beautiful task and a duty of our profession as a people organization or human resources representative, really to help the organization when you see a crisis or when you see the opportunity to change the organization to something new and bigger. This is where you need people like us. And that's why I'm so passionate about that our community keeps learning and never stops learning and never is hesitant to knock on the office door of the business and saying, "Hey, I've understand that we are changing the business. What can we do? How can we help?"
And how did you retrain those people?
I mean, that was a huge undertaking because what I've told you is not only technical change, right? It's also mindset change. Because think about it, when we had to do that in 2014, 15, 16, when we started those initiatives there, how do you explain a team which is highly successful, unbelievable margins, big revenue streams? How are you going to tell them and say, listen, this is all good. We can still milk the cash cow for maybe a next couple of years, but that will not help us in the future. And the way we did that was we identified key people within the organization whom we know are key influencers, probably not only managers, also highly regarded technical leaders, for example, or salespeople or marketing people, opinion leaders, you would call them in the governance business. And those opinion leaders, with them, we retrained the organization, and at the same time, we also made a very deliberate people choice of saying, when we bring in new people, we educate them ourselves. So we had a huge initiative starting on bringing students on board and retrain them. And when you bring those generations together, so people with 10 years plus, but also fresh starters, something is happening in the team. Yeah. So this is maybe when you look at the recent activities of all the big tech companies where they send home people, I was really shocked when I saw that the Googles and Microsofts and everybody else sent home people with a tenure of 10 years plus. Because, I mean, you need those people on board, and at the same time, you need fresh blood coming from the university and helping you also to create the future. That is also part of inclusion or diversity, I would argue. So let's see what's going to happen in those companies. The way we have chosen, of course, driven by growth, we didn't have to dismiss people, was really to re-educate opinion leaders, and on the other side, to bring in people with new mindset, different education, different point of view. And when we boil it down to our teams of 10 or the handball team, same thing. Never stop thinking about what can you as a leader do differently to have the richest, diverse aspects and ideas and opinions at the table. Never hire your own clone. Doesn't make any sense from my perspective.
Yeah, I agree.
Because over time, you will not hear different voices, different opinions, and different thoughts. Yeah.
Super interesting.
And this is what it's probably very hard to accept as a leader, because those people with a different voice, a different opinion, they also might tick differently than you.
Yes.
And that's what you need to accept if you want to reach the higher goal of better productivity and best team performance.
Very, very nice. The founders, Hasso,
Yeah.
and I think also there were 4 or 5 founders.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
came from IBM,
Mhm.
and IBM back then was the dominant player.
Yeah.
Everything was on premise back then. Did you still had to convince them, or how was the involvement of them? Did they
Yeah.
see it as well that they need to transform? Because,
Yeah.
or maybe
Yeah.
another question,
I think
what role still did the founders have at that time in 2014, 15?
yeah. First of all, it was not hard to convince them. As a matter of fact, they also drive that change in the
Mm.
background. They are very ambitious people, and that's probably also why they left IBM, because they saw the limits. The
Mm.
organization didn't give them the freedom to think about differently solving business problems, and that thought, that trigger, kept them going for decades. And since ever I've met them up to now, same setup, same belief that you have to change when you see that the customer demands are different, and when you do not meet, for example, even customer demands at all. So that's why I think their mindset of the founders helped SAP while it was a startup and growing. But it also helped them while we had to shake the planet of SAP, when at that point in time we were already 60, 70,000 people. Because for them, it was not at all an option to rest and to milk the cash cow and basically say, well, what's going to happen in 5 years? I'm already so rich, I don't need more money. That was never their desire.
Super interesting. And Stefan, you also have spent, I think, 3 years at Egon Zehnder. It's one of the leading
Yeah.
executive search firms. And you worked with a lot of senior executives with big scopes, big budgets, and a
Yeah.
lot of experience. And also, I guess, strong opinions. And also with a lot of founders, because you are advisor to McKinsey, to a lot of other companies like Balsen. Can you tell us a bit more about this level of interactions with these really
Yeah.
high performing people?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, given my probably now 30 years of experience, I don't think that it's such a big difference when you look into the corporate world, but also into small, medium business markets or startups, because the foundation of what we have just discussed in terms of how do you develop talents or lead an organization are valid in basically every organization. I would also, next to sports, I would also argue that, for example, in the governmental business, it should be much, much more prominent. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and we know the reasons why. But this is maybe also some side effect on whether we lack at this point in time some of the necessary actions within the politics, which and these guys need to help us to come back to a peaceful planet Earth, or to overcome really huge crisis. Nevertheless, when I look into other smart companies or smart people, I think the big difference, regardless if it's SAP or Balsen or startups or unicorns, is always when the people at the top are not flexible enough to think in a different way, although they might have seen the success of the past. The biggest hurdle I always saw, Thomas, was when people were hanging on the success of the past, or when people were hanging on, for example, coming back to your business more, on recruitment patterns of the past. So, for example, using a tech example, when you hire people from SAP or from Microsoft, you're always on the safe side of the house. I mean, why is that, right? But that's a pattern as a human being and as a leader, which you might have seen in the past and which helped you to be successful also in the future. But the biggest problem is this is not a guarantee to be successful also for the future. So you have to adapt, you have to change. And in my life at Egon Zehnder or as an advisor to companies, I see a lot of smart people, and I'm sure you're seeing a lot of super smart people also with people-wise in your organization. But you also see people who are not willing to get out of their comfort zone. And that's the limitation for innovation or change.
That's super interesting because when you just highlight people-wise, how we approach it is quite simple, and that's the essence of how we run searches. We always first try to understand, like a consultant, what is the environment we need to hire someone into that is needed from now to the future, and then trying to get people from exactly that environment to really drive certain change or behavior. And I think that's really helpful, but also not so easy to scope out in terms of a profile, because exactly what you said, it's not easy that you have a checklist of, okay, these are the 5 companies where we should hire from. You need to dig deeper, and that's super interesting. But what patterns do you see of those high-performing leaders, or maybe not even high-performing leaders, but these big executives or founders? What patterns do you see in all of them?
Yeah. Back these days in my school, and I just saw my old school a couple of weeks ago at the Lake of Constance, and I remember this school was, I think it was built in 1907. Very old house, nice windows, and within those windows you see even these colorful pictures, right? And there is, and this is the so-called Alexander von Humboldt Gymnasium in Constance. And there are 2 sentences in this colorful window when you enter the building, which says, "Live to learn, learn to live." That's what it is. And when I was a pupil at school, I said, I mean, what a kind of stupid sentence is this, right? But then you go into your business life and think about it and say, okay, I live to learn. That's true, because whatever I have done, I'm learning. I'm learning with my family. I'm learning with the company. I'm learning in sports. I'm always learning. I'm learning even while I'm listening to the news on television. But I also like the second part of the building when you say, okay, live to learn, but learn to live. And this learn to live gives you a very clear pattern in my mind. What I have seen, if people are not only willing, but are passionate about learning, and they're never going to give that up, even if they are experienced, or even if they have 10, 15, 20, 30 years of experience, their mantra going into each and every day into the office or working remotely is, I'm never going to give up. I might learn something from somebody who is 20 years younger than I. And this is a very fascinating aspect. And the proof point and the checkpoint, Thomas, was always for me a question I've asked some of the leaders, and I made some very relevant experiences with that one, which is the whole concept of reverse mentoring. I mean, mentoring, a lot of people are claiming they're doing mentoring for people with less experience, right? But the best learning for me was always reverse mentoring. So I have, for example, asked people who just started at SAP to join me for a week or for a day and just come along with me in all of those meetings or decisions I have to make, sitting in my office, hearing me talking to people. And then at the end of the day, we spoke about it. And I specifically asked them and said, what would you have done differently? Now, obviously, when you ask as a board member and a new startup at SAP, that person is usually a little bit hesitant, but I provoked them and I said, no, we're not going to leave the office unless you tell me what you found good or bad, or what would you have done differently. And the learning there is just unbelievable. So whenever I'm now going to see leaders, I ask them about that concept. I say, okay, have you done it? And if you don't have done it, would you please do that and tell me how you feel about it? And that tells you a lot about the mindset and the willingness to learn to live, and not only to live to learn.
Super interesting. So for me, that's being ambitious enough that you go through that journey, because doing that is, I think, also not easy. It takes a lot of courage, and you really need to have a certain drive of change for yourself as well, right? And also listening. That's super hard for some people to just listen.
Correct. Yeah. And see, Thomas, some of them told me that, so I remember exactly one excellent female talent we recruited for SAP. She said to me, have you recognized, Stefan, how your body language was at the meeting at 1:30? And so I checked myself and I said, okay, what was the meeting at 1:30? And then she said, you didn't pay attention and you were tired. I said, oh, how did you realize that? And he said, well, you didn't say a lot. You are a very passionate leader, Stefan. The passion didn't came across. You were very lean back. And he told me a lesson. I said, shit, yeah, I shouldn't do meetings when I'm tired. I shouldn't probably do 15 meetings a day. It doesn't make sense, because at a certain point in time, I'm getting tired. And then we talked about, how do we going to make sure that we have less meetings, but with a stronger focus? Because people in this meeting, they leave with a certain impression of myself. And you spread something which you don't want to spread, which basically said, well, Stefan was not paying attention and he was tired.
Super
Not
interesting.
good.
And did you also learn from that, or did you take something out of that?
Yeah, sure. Of course, as an executive board member, you acknowledge that first. You have to acknowledge that first of all by yourself, because the higher you get in the organization, the less feedback you're getting, right? Unfortunately. But then I went home and thought about this sentence, and I said, man, she's totally right. So I even planned in days when I saw it was too much. I had to tell my team and say, plan a 30 minutes just for myself, nap time. I have just to close my eyes or relax or to refresh myself. I can't do 15 meetings. I can't do that each and every day.
Yes. In case you did not subscribe to the show and you like it, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. One thing I wanted to dive into again for the organizational development piece, acquisitions. SAP did a lot of acquisitions and also integrations. Maybe some were more commercial acquisitions without integrations. But could you tell us a bit more about your role, or the overall role, and then your role of acquisitions for the success of SAP?
Right. Well, first of all, mergers and acquisitions are a very highly relevant task. We as people business practitioners have to perform. And in my mind, this is something where you have to be really right at the beginning, even in the due diligence phase being integrated. So the good news was at SAP that's where we were. So I had even dedicated resources who did nothing else than due diligence with the business. So even when we started to look into companies and organizations, somebody from the people organization was part of that. We didn't came to the table when we only talked about the post-merger integration. In my mind, very important, because when you have to prepare the deal, you need to think about the people aspect, right? And the organizational aspect. And therefore you need a specialist on board, at least one, who can help this business team to judge if it makes sense or not. Now in SAP's case, when we did mergers and acquisitions, it was always driven by technology, but also by can we acquire talented people? And therefore, this was a very natural process for us to be at the table and to talk about it. Now, from an experience perspective, unfortunately, when we started these kind of acquisitions in the early days, and it was in the mid 2005 or 6, this is where the journey started. We still had this kind of setup of what's not invented here at SAP is probably maybe second class or third class, because we were so successful. And as a result, and even if you didn't have that in mind, but that was the mentality. And when I look backwards, I think in the beginning, we too much roller coastered those organizations with all of the fun and the beauty of SAP, but didn't pay attention enough to, hey, those are smaller organizations. They have a specific way how they communicate, network, develop new products. We just told them this is the SAP way, and adapt or die, right? Now, what you see when you follow the post-merger integration process, you have a business case, you judge it after years, and then all of a sudden you find out, oops, productivity goes down, innovation goes down, people are leaving you because you're just a far too big organization. People don't want to work in such an organization. That didn't work out at all. So we had to change the way how we do acquisitions. And I remember when SuccessFactors was acquired, so this is the software for the people's organization, it was specifically said that their culture, their behavior is something we want to retain and also learn from them and combine it with our strengths. So this 1 + 1 = 3 versus 2 concept is something we had to learn, unfortunately, in a very tough way, because the first acquisitions were, from a technical perspective, successful, but probably from a people's perspective, not so much. And over the time, we got better and better and better on this one, up to the very latest ones, when you even had companies where SAP made the decision to keep them standalone, or even are bringing them on the stock exchange as a separate organization. So we had to learn the hard way of doing mergers and acquisitions. Now, there are other companies out there, especially in tech business. Look at Cisco, for example. They have a big and great tradition of doing it very well, but they have a very prescriptive way of doing it. And they tell them, this is the Cisco business, and that's how we're going to do that. And you join or you leave. But that's, I would argue, and coming back to our discussion on inclusion, or the better teams are usually the ones who are much more diverse. That's not the reason why you bought a company like that and paid a lot of money.
Especially if you don't need to do a commercial deal, right? Because you had enough revenues.
Correct. Yeah. And commercially wise, you always had in the mind, oh, well, they're going to use our sales force and it's easier, and vice versa, and we can conquer the different customers they have had in the past. No, that's not the case, because their customers, they were specifically keen on working maybe with a smaller organization or with a niche organization, and not just with this big tanker, where it was not easy to make contracts with and stuff like that. So to cut the long story short there, I think you always have to think about the specific cultural aspects of your own company, and then think about strategically how you do post-merger integration after the right due diligence. And there is no right way or wrong way. But within SAP's case, that was the learning, and I think this is keep going on until these days, where not only the commercial and or the technical aspect is an important one, but also the people side.
Interesting. And Stefan, maybe at the very end, you are now doing a lot of advisory roles and also angel investments. Can you tell us a bit more about that period of your career and how people could maybe approach you if they want to have an angel ticket?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, everybody can find me very easily through LinkedIn. And why am I these days now an angel investment for tech business, HR tech business? Because again, this is the combination. Remember when I left university, when you have heard me saying that I'm interested in people and technology. That's the same passion I'm sharing today. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people believe that the greatest and the best technology only comes from overseas or from Asia. I can tell you over the last 3 years what I've seen and learned here. I'm so excited about companies who tackle a business problem. And in our business, in the people's business, there's a lot of there are a lot of boxes which are not opened yet in comparison maybe to others. So let me give you an example. When I'm looking now into startups who want to help automotive, manufacturing, finance, there are a lot of tools and systems and processes already very, very well established. In our world of the people business, I would argue, sure. I mean, I'm not investing these days into the next and greatest payroll solution. But when I look into leadership, talent acquisition, diversity, health, those are not untapped, but untapped from a technology perspective, areas where I can definitely see that we have room of improvement. And technology can help. Technology hopefully is never gonna replace a human being, but technology can help the human being to make a better decision, an educated decision. And this is where these days with the technology out there of bots, AI, you have great opportunities to help our people organization leaders in companies, in consultant roles to do a better job. And that's why I'm passionate about it. So I've started that. I'm currently involved in 6 startups, exclusively in the HR world. Only one is in the medical device business, completely different. There, I'm totally uneducated, but I just felt that the technology is so great. And on the people's technology side, there I can see 2 things again: technology, interesting solutions and algorithms they are developing, and at the same time, fascinating small teams, diverse teams, female founders, which you hardly see in the corporate world at this point in time, and that excites me so much.
Super interesting. Stefan, thank you very much for your time and being my guest. I always love the conversations with you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. All the best also for your organization, and always reach out. Thanks for the opportunity. Take care.